Hey, Robert.
Hey, Ron.
So we've talked about this in the past, but there's a lot of exciting things happening in the kind of pharma biotech space. I think the FDA this week approved, or last week approved the first CRISPR application, the first gene editing treatment for sickle cell anemia, and it's I mean the results that I've seen have just been astounding. It was also approved even previously by the British authorities, and there's a lot in the pipeline. Hopefully, that'll be approved over the next few months, next few years. And there's just a lot of interesting breakthroughs. There's a lot of interesting science. There's a lot of cool stuff happening. You had a story about this technology about that has the potential to get rid of all cavities once and for all.
Yeah, and it's sort of the polar opposite of CRISPR. When I saw the news, I also saw something that suggested that the original CRISPR technology was able to edit about 15% of the genome, and apparently they've got it up to close to 100%. So as you would expect, it's initially this breakthrough, but then there's been continuous improvement and very, very rapid improvement. But the ingenuity doesn't always require huge technological breakthroughs. It's doing things and being aware of what's going on and looking for answers to why things are the way they are. And there is a new treatment that is a prophylactic. It's a preventative for tooth decay. So the idea is not to cure tooth decay and cavities, but to set it up so you don't have them at all. And it's super clever and has all sorts of challenges that you wouldn't think initially, because most people know that tooth decay is caused because food in your mouth, particularly sugars, get metabolized by bacteria, and one of the bacterial waste ingredients is acidic, and there are particular bacteria that produce a lot of acid from sugar, and that acid eats in the enamel of the tooth, and then you end up with cavities. And what these people have found is that there are naturally occurring bacteria in some people's mouths, a mutation on that type of, not that particular bacteria, but on a different bacteria that makes it both robust, the bacteria, but also produce very little acid in its waste. And so if you could replace the bacteria that produce a lot of acid with the bacteria that don't produce hardly any acid at all, then you would be able to have no tooth decay, no acid being produced, and virtually no tooth decay. And what they found is there's a particular type of the low acid bacteria that produces a mild antibiotic as a waste ingredient that helps it outcompete the high acid bacteria. And so what they're doing is they're giving people deep cleanings, which means getting rid of a lot of the bacteria in your mouth. You can't get rid of all of it,
Yep.
but you can get rid of a lot of it, and then it repopulates. But after the cleaning, you put the desirable bacteria, the one that outcompetes the high acid bacteria but doesn't produce much acid, you inoculate into the mouth. It gets a foothold, and then it can't be, with the existing biome that we know of, it won't be replaced. Now, you can't just toss it in the mouth and expect it to replace the entrenched bacteria that are in there causing cavities. But if you get them out, so step one, deep cleaning, most people get their teeth cleaned, so this is not a big deal. Step two, bacteria, your mouth is full of bacteria, you can't avoid it. Seems like a no-brainer, except they were looking at it and said, we can't go through the FDA for this. It just costs too much to get a treatment approved by the FDA. So this can't be a medical treatment because it's a one-shot deal. You get a dental cleaning and then you get this in, and if you charge enough to make it interesting after having paid the cost of getting FDA approved, well, then you're not going to have a huge market. And it's a very low cost treatment. Like, you could make money by charging, $200 for the deep cleaning and $200 for the inoculation, and then you don't get cavities for a lifetime. So what do? Well, they're very clever, they are trying to get it approved as a supplement, based on the fact that there are existing supplements that are being sold that are microbial. A lot of the probiotic movement is introducing good bacteria into your gut, and that's accepted. That's seen as healthy and safe. And doing the same thing to your mouth is not a big stretch, and wouldn't require huge clinical trials, and wouldn't cost $2 billion to get passed. So the tooth decay may become a thing of the past, because these folks have figured out a way to improve the biome in your mouth, and more importantly, to bypass the FDA approval process, so something that's safe and effective can actually reach people.
That is so cool. That is so cool. But this whole FDA approval, which is super expensive, unbelievably expensive, and then what happens is drug companies then charge a lot of money for the drugs that they finally get approval on, because I can't share the number. It's something like $1.6 billion to get a drug through the trials and through approval and everything, and most drugs don't make it through the approval. So they have to charge a lot of money. But this, of course, creates massive political angst. People don't like to pay, and insurance goes up. Healthcare prices seem to only go up. There's constant political talk about this. So the Biden administration is really dedicated to finding ways to cutting drug prices. I think we talked in a previous show about their efforts to list the top 10 most expensive drugs and then force those drug companies to lower the price, basically put price controls on them. They don't call it that because they say it's just Medicare negotiating, but Medicare negotiates with a big, big gun. And now they've come up with a new scheme, which is kind of interesting, horrible, but interesting. And that is that if your drug was based on research that the government funded, at basic research the government funded, which a lot of drugs are today because the government basically funds much of medical basic research, then the government is going to have the right to, if they don't like the price that you're charging, to basically allow other companies to give them the patent, in a sense, share the patent with them, so that they can use the same basic research to develop good drugs that compete with you. In other words, void your patent protection, which allows you to charge those high prices to recuperate the costs of everything. And it seems like there's this idea that you can subsidize the industry, you can regulate it, price control it, and there are no consequences to it, right? It's just, okay, we get lower prices. That's cool. Let's go for it. So talk a little bit about what happens when all of this unfolds.
Well, it's a really interesting question, because it comes down to intellectual property, and intellectual property is a complex trade-off. From an Ingenuism standpoint, intellectual property reduces connection, because you get a legally mandated monopoly for a period of time, but it also improves the incentives and the resources available for experimentation, exploration, discovery, and then actually turning ideas into useful insights and sometimes life-saving drugs. I'm going to push back on one thing that you said. I agree with all of it, with the exception of healthcare costs tend to go up, except for pharmaceuticals that come off of patent protection.
Yep.
So when something becomes generic, the price typically falls by somewhere from 70 to 90%. So you get the same efficacy a year later, with a much lower cost. Now you have to wait through that first period, and for people who either want to ignore economics or don't understand economics, there's the thought, well, we should just shorten that period. And it's worth talking about as long as you acknowledge the trade-offs. And I haven't seen any discussion of the trade-offs on this particular proposal. But then this administration shoots proposals out like a machine gun. I don't think this one is even plausible, not just because of the economics, but because the original legislation was Birchby and Bob Dole. They went across the aisle, so it was a bipartisan decision of, look, there's a serious problem is we have all this basic research, but nobody is using it. So we basically have these ideas and these hints, but nobody is producing useful insights from it and actual commercialized products to benefit the entire world. So there's a huge potential gain. It's like the $20 bills sitting on the sidewalk. Sometimes they're there, but then you need to pick them up. And what this legislation was to do is to have a channel for those scientific discoveries to become useful products. And one of the clauses in it was, if you take some intellectual property that was produced in a government lab or in a university lab, because universities had the same technology transfer problem, there wasn't clear ownership of intellectual property, so nobody wanted to put at that time it was only $500 million to get an approved treatment, but now it's $2 billion. Nobody was willing to do that, so you just had discoveries languishing. So the clause was, if you take that intellectual property, but you don't use it, we will take it back and let someone else take it that will use it. So you couldn't just grab and hold these patents. You had to actually develop them. And the language that they used was to make it readily available to the public. And if you look back at the conversations at the time around the legislation, it was very clear. There are very clear statements saying that price is not one of those considerations. It was, do you take this and do you commercialize it?
Yep.
And then you get normal patent protection, which was the carrot for companies to do that, and helped build the U.S. pharmaceutical industry and make it global leading and life-saving industry. And so this is now saying that the proposal is to say, well, to make it readily available to the public, it has to be cheap. And legitimately, you could make that argument. It's just counter to the actual legislation. And we do have a constitution where the executive branch doesn't get to legislate; they only get to implement the legislation. And in this case, it seems pretty cut and dry. So my sense is that this is just another one of the many proposals, and that they may keep coming back with it, but it's part, well, we do want to do these things because we think it's important to forgive student loans or to take back intellectual property, to lower pharmaceutical prices by any means necessary, damn the consequences. And there's also the optical part of it. Is this administration seems, there's a previous administration as well, let's just be clear, this is not, it's bipartisan, seems to be very interested in proposals to further their political standing. So if you think about like the student loan forgiveness comes with an email ostensibly from Joe Biden saying, I'm going to forgive your loan, the forgiveness you've earned and deserve. And Donald Trump made the Treasury put his signature on all the COVID stimulus checks. It was, these people are shameless. But the positive side of it is, I don't think there'll be a lot of meat on this, but it does point to a real problem for Ingenuism, which is regulation, not regulation, period, because regulation is part of the rules that help support an effective environment for innovation. But regulation as a weapon or as a tool to implement policy preferences. So you don't say, how are we going to make innovation work better? You say, oh, we want prescription drugs prices to be lower, so here's something we could do that in the short term would lower them. We're going to sacrifice innovation for the rest of history, but we don't really give a crap about that because we're focused on this other thing. And so you look at any sort of the evolution of any regulation, it often starts with, oh, we want to do something that is very noble and often ill-defined, and then it turns into a changing set of rules depending on who's in power that is implementing their policy preferences. And so when you read about regulating AI, you can absolutely believe that it's necessary, but still be skeptical that it can happen in a way that would produce the results you would want, and will likely not while producing huge unintended consequences that you don't want.
And the sad thing is almost always that the unintended consequences are then not blamed on the regulations so much as blamed on some other phenomena. So what you get is another layer of regulations to deal with the unintended consequences that in themselves have unintended consequences. And you know, if you look at regulations, they seem to always just increase over time and suppress connection, suppress experimentation. I mean, that's a big part of what regulations often do, particularly when they're top down, when they're coming from the government, is suppress that experimentation, which is what they worry about and what they fear. And of course, layered upon layered to the point where at some point you don't even know what is causing what. You can't even find the causal relationships because of the complexity, and the perverse incentives are so prevalent.
And if you're evaluating things one by one, you're like, okay, well, we need to do this because the situation without it is untenable. So this isn't great, but it's better than the alternative, as opposed to looking at, well, how can we optimize this across the board? Because it's not just more rules to solve the unintended consequences. Often there are straight up counterbalancing rules. Yep. Where you end up with a bunch of rules that cancel themselves out, but you still have to follow all the rules. And you know, one way to think about this is, if you look at a lot of markets, what you see is the government subsidizing it on one hand and restricting it on the other. So you see that with housing markets. You see a lot of rules that make it difficult to build, and then you see money being spent to try and create affordable housing. Or you see it in medicine.
Or a tax deduction on mortgages just to get people into homes.
You see it with on mortgages on both sides. You see it in the FDA has we've created all of these costs, and they're one size fits all. So you can, because I am not an advocate for just eliminating the FDA. I'm an advocate for experimenting how we can shrink it and get all of the benefits, or 98% of the benefits at 2% of the cost. Now, is that possible? Maybe it's 90%.
The solution might be to privatize it and have competing FDA.
But you'd have to start, you would have to find something to replace it, because sure. I just wanted to be clear that even if you think there should be an FDA, the FDA that we have makes no sense, because it's applying one size fits all, same to introducing naturally occurring bacteria into people's mouths to solve tooth decay, as to creating a potentially both life-saving but also potentially deadly treatment. And that doesn't make any sense. Have we lost all of our audio quality?
All of our what?
All of our audio quality?
No, I think we're fine. Why?
Okay, good. Well, because I just, a leaf blower just came outside of my office. So, and if you were to be looking at the entirety of any of these regulatory apparatus, or if you were starting from scratch, you would not get anything closely resembling. And when you offset rules with rules, let's take the subsidize while also restricting. It's like subsidizing, you're trying to increase demand, and restricting, you're trying to either decrease supply or increase supply or decrease price. And you're eliminating the natural connection that markets have. When people work together and they decide to transact, it provides really useful information. And if you are distorting prices on both sides, on both the producer and the consumer side, then you're going to get outcomes that no one would have ever dreamed of voluntarily, participating in, and yet everyone's participating because, given all the rules, it's the best they can do.
Yes, I mean it's incredibly distortive, and markets are these mechanisms by which, because of connection and because of feedback loops, because of feedback mechanisms, you really do over time kind of come up with solutions to problems. I mean, it's not like markets eliminate all problems instantaneously, but they're geared towards working towards a solution, and they're geared towards figuring out ways to regulate problems and to get rid of problems, over time again, but kind of without the unintended consequences, because there's a cost to pay for the unintended consequences, and participants in the market bear it directly. Whereas with regulations, there's a massive cost to pay, but it's not the regulators who bear it. It's typically consumers or producers who bear the cost, and therefore you don't get the feedback mechanism that provides the right incentive for the right kind of behavior over time.
And that's, I think, a really important way to put it, is that you have the feedback and the learning that happens inside a market where the rules are just sort of emerging, they're bubbling up from what people are doing. That tends to solve problems, like you said, not instantaneously, and it tends to uncover new problems, but they're the kind of problems that they're better problems.
Yeah.
It's like you go from how do we get around, okay, well, horses, how do we deal with all this horse crap? Well, we go to cars, okay, how do we deal with carbon? Now we have nuclear power. How do we, it's just continually getting better. And when you have a regulated environment, it doesn't seem to get that way. It seems to get worse and worse. The problems, you're solving problems that you don't want to have, that you wish you didn't have. And that, we argue, stems 100% from people being willing to sacrifice the key elements of what makes progress happen. And you see that in the proposal for stepping in to take intellectual property from people who have spent billions of dollars to develop it. That's, you're sacrificing what really makes things work, versus being willing to step in and say, okay, you took this intellectual property for whatever reason, you haven't developed it at all. We're going to put it back in the pot and give other people a chance to develop it.
Yep. I still wish I had a time machine, go back and get those bacteria in my mouth when I was a kid, because I've got so many cavities.
It would be amazing. And the one of the funny things about it is, you're born with no bacteria in your mouth. So if we were to do this for a generation of people, the parents would almost certainly, certainly in the majority of cases, pass it on to their kids, not because it's genetic, but because the bacteria in a newborn's mouth comes from somewhere, and it almost certainly comes from, in the cases that it comes to the people who are around them the most. Yep. And yep. That would be the parents. So, if we had gotten it, we would have given it to our kids, who would give it to our grandkids, who would give it, we could get rid of most of tooth decay within a generation or two. And it still may happen, because apparently this company is selling the first, you get to be, it's almost like an NFT, you get to be the first ones who, younger crypto type optimists who are willing to pay $10,000 so they can cover their initial costs of getting it all set up and getting it approved as a supplement. And then they'll start selling it for $200. And I'm wondering if dentists will buy it, though.
Yeah, I was going to say.
It's like LASIK surgery. LASIK surgery was a huge business for a while, and then it went away because all the people who wanted it had it, and you only have the next generation. This is even worse, because the next generation, it's like their eyes will autocorrect just because their parents got LASIK. So
it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting how markets adapt to these kind of things, but
that is 100% progress. If we need fewer dentists and fewer drills, I think we'll all be happy.
Oh yeah, absolutely. All right, thanks, Robert. I will see you next week.
Thanks, Yaron. Talk soon.
Bye.